The cry in the snow. The storm had been blowing for hours. Up in the high country, the winds carried ice like knives, cutting through wool, leather, and flesh. Snow fell in heavy sheets, swallowing tracks almost as soon as they were made. The trees bent beneath its weight, creaking in protest, as if the whole mountain were groaning under the burden of winter. Daniel Boone McGraw, known simply as Boone to the scattered ranchers and trappers of the Montana range, leaned forward in his saddle, squinting into the whiteness. His horse, a seasoned chestnut gelding, kept its head down, plowing forward through the drifts. Boone was headed home from a supply trip that had taken longer than he'd planned. The small frontier town had been buzzing with Christmas cheer, but Boone had stayed no longer than necessary. He wasn't a man made for crowds or noise. His cabin, tucked against the base of Eagle Ridge, was the only place he could breathe freely. The cold didn't bother him the way it might bother others. He had lived too many years alone in the wilderness. His body had grown tough, hardened, almost a part of the mountains themselves. But that night, something gnawed at him. Something he couldn't name. It was as if the storm itself carried a warning. He was about to urge his horse faster when a sound pierced the wind, faint, almost swallowed by the storm. Boone straightened, pulling the reins. He listened. At first, he thought it was a wolf howl, carried down the slope. But then it came again, sharper, roar. A cry. Not an animal. Not out here. A baby. Boone's blood turned to ice that had nothing to do with the weather. He kicked his gelding forward, heart pounding, listening for the sound. The wind carried it, distant, then closer, until he saw the faintest shape ahead, a shadow half buried near the tree-lean. Boone leapt from his horse before it even stopped. The snow swallowed him to the knees as he ran. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, caught the form, a woman, curled against a fallen log, her body hunched protectively around a tiny bundle in her arms. The baby's cries were thin, weak, more whimper than wail now. "God Almighty!" Boone muttered, dropping to his knees beside them. The woman stirred weakly, lifting her head. Snow clung to her lashes, her lips were cracked and blue, and her eyes, dark, wide, desperate, tried to focus on him. "Help-a-him," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. Boone stripped his heavy buffalo hide coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around both mother and child. He pulled the baby close first, tucking the bundle into the warmth of his chest, then lifted the woman into his arms as though she weighed no more than a fawn. She tried to protest, but no sound came. "Save your strength," Boone said firmly. "You're comin' with me." He carried her back to the horse, shifting the child into one arm while keeping the mother against his chest with the other. Somehow, he managed to haul them both up into the saddle, then swung himself up behind them. "Hang on," he muttered, though he doubted she heard. The ride back to his cabin felt endless. Boone's horse pushed through the drifts with dogged determination, but the woman sagged more heavily against him with each mile, her breath shallow, her head lolling. The baby quieted after a while, pressed tight against Boone's warmth, but Boone knew silence was as dangerous as crying when it came to infants. By the time they reached the cabin, Boone's jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. He slid from the horse, cradling mother and child, and shouldered the door open with a grunt. The warmth inside was faint. He'd left only a few coals banked in the hearth, but it was shelter at least. He laid the woman on his bed, her dark hair spilling across the pillow, and pulled the baby into his arms again. Then he worked quickly, throwing logs onto the fire until flames leapt high, filling the room with a golden glow. Only then did he really look at them. The woman was young, no more than her early 20s. Her face, though pale and drawn with exhaustion, was striking, with high cheekbones and soft, delicate features. She wore a dress torn at the hem and a thin shawl that had been no match for the blizzard. Her hands were scraped and raw, as though she'd been walking for days. The baby was tiny, swaddled in rags. Boone gently unwrapped them, checking for frostbite. The little boy's skin was chilled but still pink, his fists curled, his eyes squinting shut against the firelight. Boone let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Tough little feller," he murmured. "You'll make it." He fed the fire again, then set water to boil. He found blankets, wrapping both mother and child in as much warmth as he could spare. Finally, he pulled a flask from his shelf and touched it to the woman's lips. She stirred faintly, swallowing a mouthful of the strong liquid. Her lashes fluttered. "Why you?" she whispered. "Rest easy," Boone said gruffly. "You're safe now." Her eyes filled with tears. She clutched the baby closer, whispering something Boone couldn't catch before sleep claimed her again. Boone stood over them, arms crossed, his rough face unreadable. He had lived alone in that cabin for nearly a decade, ever since the war had taken everything from him. He'd made peace with solitude. Or so he thought. Now, looking at the fragile pair shivering beneath his blankets, something shifted in his chest. Something fierce, protective, and utterly unexpected. He sighed, rubbing his beard. "Looks like it's just us three tonight," he muttered. The storm raged outside, but inside, the fire burned steady. And for the first time in years, Boone felt the walls of his cabin weren't quite so empty. The night stretched long. Boone tended them tirelessly, keeping the fire roaring, coaxing the woman to sip broth when she stirred, making sure the baby stayed warm. The boy cried often, his little lungs straining, until Boone found a rag and dipped it in warm milk from a tin he kept stored. It wasn't perfect, but it eased the child, who soon fell into a restless sleep against his chest. Boone rocked him gently, the way he remembered his mother doing for his baby sister back in Kentucky. It had been more than 30 years, yet the motion came naturally, surprising him. "You sure know how to turn a man's world upside down," he muttered to the infant. The baby stirred, a tiny fist wrapping around Boone's finger. Boone froze, then let out a shaky breath he hadn't meant to release. That simple touch, small and trusting, felt like it cracked something open in him that had been sealed for years. Toward dawn, the storm began to ease. Pale light crept in through the frost-covered window. Boone, bone-tired, sat in a chair near the fire, the baby still asleep against him. The woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she blinked at the unfamiliar room, confusion flickering across her face. Then memory struck, and her gaze shot to her child. Boone leaned forward, gently placing the baby back in her arms. "He's fine," he said softly. "Hungry and loud, but fine." Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the boy. "Thank God." Boone studied her a moment before speaking. "Name's Boone. Daniel Boone McGraw, though most just call me Boone." She looked up at him, her lips trembling. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Dawson. And this is my son, Samuel." Boone nodded slowly. The names settled into the room like something permanent. He poured her a cup of water, set it in her hands, then crouched down to eye level. "Clara," he said quietly, "what in God's name were you doing out there in the middle of a storm with a babe in your arms?" Her eyes darkened with shadows, her body trembling despite the blankets. She looked away, clutching Samuel tighter. Boone waited. He was not a man of many words, but his silence was steady, patient, unyielding. Finally, she drew a shuddering breath. "They put us out," she whispered. "Said we had no place there. No food left for another mouth. I begged, but—" Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her child's head. Boone's jaw tightened, rage sparking in his chest. To turn a woman and child out into a Montana blizzard, it was unthinkable, cruel beyond measure. "You won't be out again," he said, his voice like iron. "Not while I'm breathing, duh." Clara looked at him then, really looked, and in her eyes Boone saw fear, but also a fragile thread of hope. For the first time in years, Boone knew his life had just changed, though he didn't yet know how deep or how far. The storm outside might have been dying, but inside his cabin, something new had been born, something that would not be so easily extinguished. A place to belong. The storm had blown itself out by morning, leaving the world outside buried under a deep white stillness. Boone stepped onto the porch, the air sharp against his face. The snow stretched in all directions, clean and silent, broken only by the smoke curling from his chimney and the tracks left by his horse. Inside, Clara stirred a pot of broth over the fire. Her movements were slow, stiff from the night's ordeal, but there was a quiet determination in her every action. Samuel slept in a makeshift cradle Boone had fashioned from a wooden box lined with furs. The tiny boy's soft breathing was the only sound. "You didn't have to do that," Boone said when he came back in, stamping the snow from his boots. Clara looked up, her dark eyes steady though her voice was gentle. "You saved us. The least I can do is try to help." Boone shrugged, unfastening his coat. "Still, you need your strength. Broth's good for you, but it'll keep just fine without fussin' over it." She gave a small smile, the first he had seen from her. "I'm used to fussing. It's all I've done since Samuel came into this world." Boone felt something shift in his chest at her words, though he only nodded and set about feeding the fire. The day passed slowly. Clara told him little, though Boone didn't press. He could see the weight she carried in the way she held Samuel as though the world might snatch him away. Boone busied himself with chores, chopping wood, hauling water, checking the snares he'd set near the creek. But each time he returned, he found himself looking for her, for both of them. That evening, as the wind picked up again outside, Clara finally spoke more of her story. Boone was seated at the table, mending a strap, when she said quietly, "I came west with my husband. He was looking for land. We thought we'd find a fresh start." Boone looked up, meeting her gaze. There was no ring on her hand. "He didn't make it," she whispered. "Fever took him before Samuel was born. I was left with nothing but what I could carry. A family in town let me stay a while, but when the baby came, they said there wasn't enough food. They sent me away." Her voice trembled, but she steadied it. "I walked as far as I could, hoping to find someone who'd take us in. If you hadn't found us—" She trailed off, her eyes glistening. Boone's chest burned with anger, not at her, but at the cruelty of people who'd turn out a woman and infant in winter. He clenched the strap in his hands, then set it down carefully. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough but steady. "That's what matters." Clara nodded, but Boone could see how hard she fought to believe it. The days turned into weeks. Clara grew stronger, her color returning, and Samuel thrived in the warmth of Boone's cabin. Boone found himself adjusting to their presence in ways he hadn't expected. He woke to Samuel's cries in the night, stumbling from his bed to help soothe the child while Clara rested. He split wood with more purpose now, knowing the fire warmed not just himself but the 2 lives depending on it. Clara, for her part, filled the cabin with quiet industry. She mended Boone's shirts, tended to the cooking, and swept the floors until the place felt less like a lonely outpost and more like a home. Boone had grown used to silence over the years, but the gentle hum of Clara's lullabies as she rocked Samuel made that silence feel less like emptiness and more like peace. One evening, as the snow fell in soft flakes outside, Boone found himself lingering by the hearth, watching Clara with the baby. She sat in the rocking chair, Samuel nestled against her shoulder, his tiny fist curled in her hair. The firelight painted her face in warm gold. "You're good with him," Boone said before he could stop himself. Clara smiled faintly. "I'm his mama. That's all I can be." Boone hesitated, then spoke softly. "You're more than that. You've got strength most folks don't." She looked at him then, really looked, and Boone felt the weight of her gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, a spark neither had expected but neither could deny. But peace, Boone knew, never lasted long in the mountains. One afternoon, as he returned from checking his traps, he saw smoke rising in the distance, not from his cabin, but farther down the valley. Riders. Strangers. By evening, 3 men appeared at his door. Rough-looking, with hard eyes and worn rifles slung across their backs. Boone stepped out to meet them, his own hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Evenin'," Boone said evenly. The leader, a thick-set man with a scar down his cheek, spat into the snow. "Evenin'. Heard tell you took in a woman. Clara Dawson." Boone's jaw tightened. "What of it?" "She was stayin' with my brother's family. Cost 'em more than she was worth. Should have let her freeze, but I reckon she owes us for the trouble. We've come to collect." His grin was cruel. Boone's blood ran hot. He thought of Clara's thin shoulders, the way she'd whispered Samuel's name like it was her last prayer. He thought of that first night, of the baby's weak cry in the storm. "You best turn around," Boone said, his voice low and dangerous. "Ain't nothin' for you here." The man's grin faltered. "Now, friend." Boone's pistol was in his hand before the man could blink, steady as iron. "I said turn around." For a long moment, the men weighed him. Boone's eyes, cold as the mountain itself, did not waver. Finally, the leader cursed and jerked his head. The riders turned, their horses crunching through the snow until they disappeared into the trees. Boone stood there long after they were gone, his breath fogging the air. When he stepped back inside, Clara was standing by the hearth, Samuel in her arms, her face pale. She had heard every word. "They'll come back," she whispered. Boone crossed the room, his presence filling the space. "Let 'em," he said fiercely. "They won't take you. Not while I'm here." Clara's eyes brimmed with tears, but this time she didn't look away. Instead, she reached out, her free hand brushing his rough, calloused fingers. "You've already done more than anyone ever has for me," she said softly. "Why?" Boone's throat tightened. He had no simple answer. He'd lived half his life with no one, believing that was his fate. But now, "Because no one deserves to face this world alone," he said finally. His eyes flicked to Samuel. "And that boy deserves better than what he's been given." For a moment, silence wrapped around them, thick and tender. Clara's hand lingered against his. Boone's heart pounded like it hadn't in years. Spring came slowly, melting the snow into rushing streams, coaxing green back into the valley. Boone's cabin, once a place of solitude, had become something far more. Clara laughed more easily now. Samuel grew stronger, his cries turning into cheerful babbles. Boone found himself smiling at things he'd long forgotten how to smile at. The smell of bread baking, the sound of Clara humming as she hung laundry in the sun, the baby's tiny hand gripping his beard with surprising strength. One evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Boone sat on the porch with Clara beside him, Samuel asleep in her arms. The mountains loomed quiet and eternal around them. "Do you ever wish for something else?" Boone asked softly. Clara looked down at Samuel, then back at Boone. "I used to wish for a place to belong. Somewhere safe. Someone to share the burden with. Now," she smiled, her eyes shining, "now I think I've found it." Boone swallowed hard, his rough hand reaching out to cover hers. "Reckon I've found it too." The night was still, but Boone's heart was full. For the first time in years, he wasn't just a mountain man surviving against the odds. He was something more, a protector, a father in all but name, a man who'd opened his door to the storm and found family instead. And as Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, Boone knew he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never felt the cold bite of the world alone again.